I have two reviews for you, the short one and the long one. Here's the short one. The Fallout show explores the American wasteland over 200 years after a nuclear apocalypse. It faithfully embodies the tone of the games that inspired it, skillfully pairing wacky and irreverent humor with horror and the sobering realities of war. It succeeds more often than it fails at building upon established Fallout lore, rather than reinventing it. We meet a cast of characters that are rooted in their worlds, whether naive vault dwellers or scrappy wastelanders, battle-eager Brotherhood soldiers, or desperate NCR survivors. They faithfully embody their society's strengths, weaknesses, ignorance, intelligence, and quirks. The plot and pacing expertly guides us through the wasteland and these societies, revealing world-building surprises slowly until the story crescendos into a world-unraveling finale that is as intense as it is controversial. The story is solid, with a few plot holes that could be easily wrapped up in a second season, but leave us asking questions until then. All 8 episodes are peppered with numerous instances of exceptionally written dialogue, so that I can forgive the few examples that were a bit cringeworthy. Its use of practical effects and props make the world feel more real, and though there are a few examples of CGI that doesn't quite work, most of it does. Viewers who are new to Fallout will enjoy a fun, violent, witty, and immersive new universe. Gamers who are familiar with Fallout will see things they recognize in every frame, hear names they remember in every episode, and see the dramatization of a world they already know while getting to know new characters and a new story. The showrunners achieve telling a story that is faithful to the lore of the games. There are a few exceptions, but Fallout succeeds far more often than it fails. It is one of the few game-to-film adaptations that works. 8 out of 10 stars. I'll do my best to avoid end-of-series spoilers so that you can watch this and then still go back to the show and be surprised at the end, but I can't do this video without revealing some plot spoilers in the show. So if you want to avoid spoilers, turn back now. The Fallout universe is set in an alternative timeline that diverged from our timeline somewhere in the 1950s or early 60s. Unlike in our timeline, though, however, the style and architecture of the Fallout universe stuck to its 1950s roots. Even as hundreds of years progressed, the future became what people in the 1950s imagined the future would be like. This atom punk style gives Fallout its signature look. It would have been really easy for the showrunners to just go to their local vintage shop and buy up a bunch of stuff and use that to stage the show. But instead, the showrunners went right to the games for inspiration, and in cases that are far too numerous to count, faithfully reproduced so many aspects of this world that give it its unique style and flavor. From boxed goods to appliances, billboards to posters, art and vending machines. It's all straight from the game. The Radiation King radio, the Radiation King television, the cameras we find scattered across the wasteland, comic book characters like Grognak the Barbarian, which we learned from the show was turned into an animated TV show, the Pip-Boy, and the video games we can play on the Pip-Boy like Atomic Command. Bobbleheads, of course, bobbleheads. Nuka-Cola, of course, we see Nuka-Cola bottles everywhere. The show gives us both the vending machine as it appears in Fallout 3 and as it appears in Fallout 4. The terminals function exactly like the ones from Fallout 4. We even get an extended hacking sequence. Holotapes do appear, but they don't look like holotapes from the games. Instead, these holotapes are video holotapes, which play entire movies. Sugar bombs, yum yum deviled eggs,
Blamco mac and cheese,
cram, Fancyland snack cakes. We get stim packs that function just like stim packs from the game, a sort of magical instant heal. Radaway that cures radiation sickness, just like it does in the games. Abraxo cleaner in a bottle this time instead of in a box like we find it in the games. They of course have the T60 power armor. They can be modified at power armor repair stations. The fusion cores are perfect. One really nice touch was that I noticed they included the art that we can add to our settlements using the settlement builder in Fallout 4. This art is found predominantly in vaults, but all of these paintings are pulled right from the game. We find mini nukes, and I can't believe he's just walking right past that mini nuke. Missed opportunity. We see pre-war posters that encourage young men to enlist in the military. Posters advertising famous brands like Sunset Sarsaparilla, Abraxo Cleaner, Horizon, and Skylanes Airlines with their beautiful single-wing aircraft. We see copies of Tesla Science Magazine, the Wasteland Survival Guide, and many different copies of it. They took the liberty of putting a little screen on the machine gun turrets, but aside from that, they're exactly like the ones from the games. Weaponry is done exceptionally well. We find the junk jet, the assault rifle, which is carried by Brotherhood of Steel soldiers, the laser pistol, even the 10mm pistol. There are plenty of new weapons added to the show, just like new weapons are added to every new Fallout game. We see few robots, but we do find the wreckage of an Assaultron and a fully functioning Mr. Handy. There are two-headed Brahmin, iguana on a stick. And if you know where the iguana comes from, that's terrifying. The show also has lots of Easter eggs and phrases from the games that we'd be familiar with. In Fallout 3, ghouls refer to non-irradiated humans as smooth skins.
We got us a smooth skin visitor.
And in the show, they call them smoothies.
Dang, smoothies can be so unkind. But you got a smoothie of your own.
During an election in Vault 33, we see election posters all over the place, much like the election posters we see in the ruins of Vault 11 in Fallout New Vegas. We see characters that have clearly invested in the cannibal perk. Each episode ends with the slow, zoom-out camera, which is an iconic part of the Fallout franchise. It was in the very first Fallout game during the introductory sequence. It was in Fallout 3, and they give us a new one in a very similar style at the end of every episode. Galaxy News makes an appearance, that good old Interplay logo. Cooper Howard starred in a film called A Man and His Dog, which is an Easter egg because the Fallout franchise itself was partially inspired by a film called A Boy and His Dog. The actor who went on to voice the Mr. Handys in the Fallout universe played a character in a movie named
I, Bartholomew Codsworth, am ever ready to serve.
Bartholomew Codsworth, which of course is a reference to Codsworth from Fallout 4. We even get an ice cream social reference.
Hey, y'all here for the ice cream social? I'm afraid I got some bad news for you.
Which is hilarious to me because it's like they keep having to throw these ice cream socials at us ever since the Point Lookout DLC of Fallout 3. Why did so many Americans before the war go to ice cream socials? There is a radio station that plays in the wasteland. It's not Galaxy News Radio, it's not Diamond City Radio, but instead, they play nothing but fiddle music. Which is a lot like Radio Freedom, the Minutemen's radio station from Fallout 4.
Hi, how are you?
I complained about the lack of Corvega cars in a previous video, and that's true, most of the cars look like Chevys, but they do show us one Corvega car. The Fusion Flea shows up for a brief scene. The name of the dog in the show may be CX404, but he's still dog meat.
I'm sorry, dog meat, but you ain't him.
And of course, they had to say the line,
War never changes.
a couple of times too.
War never changes.
The show carries on the traditions of the games in many ways. In particular, they get random encounters. All of the characters just randomly bump into weird people out there. There's the time Maximus broke up a fight, only to learn that the guy he let go was trying to violate this poor man's chickens.
The guy was f***ing my chickens.
Then there's this NPC moment. This guy lives in a shack really close to a primary town, but he's never been there.
What's Philly?
Town. It's over right here. Never been myself.
You've never been over that hill?
which is kind of like many NPCs in the games who live a stone's throw away from the primary city and they claim they've never been there. For the Preston Garvey fans out there, there is of course a moment where Lucy gets a quest location marked on her map. And there's even a jab about side quests distracting you from the primary quest.
Yeah, well, the Wasteland's got its own golden receiver.
Oh, what's that?
Thou shalt get sidetracked by bullshit every goddamn time.
It couldn't be more true. In addition to exploring vaults 33, 32, and 31, which are part of the primary plot, the main characters get to explore Vault 4, a completely unrelated vault, and uncover its unique story and the horrors that happened there. I'm going to be covering this in a dedicated video later, but it's another example of the show staying true to the nature of the games. Because that's a big part of the games, is accidentally finding your way to a nearby ruined Vault-Tec vault and uncovering the horrible experiments within. As I said, they could have so easily just gone to a secondhand store or a vintage market and bought a bunch of stuff. But they didn't. They played the games. They researched the games. And in 8 episodes, they put in so many game references, there's no way I can cover them all here. I went through all 8 episodes, and I saved clips of every bit of dialogue and writing that I thought was really well done. And when I went to make this part of the video, I saw that I had way too many collected. I can't get through them all, so I'm just going to focus on a few. There were a number of lines that stood out to me in the series. I think the best one is one that they included in a recent trailer as well.
What happened?
It's the same thing that always happens. Everyone wants to save the world, they disagree on how.
That one line, I think, really embodies all of the factions in the Fallout franchise, both in the games and in this show. It's one of the main reasons that fans have been discussing and debating and arguing about their favorite faction for years. Everyone thinks they're saving the world. Even the Master thought he was saving the world. Another one that stood out to me is when Norm confronted his cousin, who's about ready to leave for Vault 32. They had just found out what really went on in Vault 32. But instead of doing anything about it, Chet decides to forget what he saw. In response, Norm says,
"You're a coward. You know that, Chet?"
We all are, Norm. That's why we live in a vault.
And that's certainly a theme with the Fallout show. Many of the people above ground consider vault dwellers to be cowards.
The vaults were nothing more than a hole in the ground for rich folks to hide in, while the rest of the world burned.
Rich folk who could survive the apocalypse and were too chicken to face it. The cowardice is something that Chet has come to terms with, but it's something that doesn't really sit well with Norm. He realizes that he is chicken, and maybe he is a coward, but he doesn't want to be. At the very beginning of the series, in order to comfort his daughter who is worried about a nuclear apocalypse, Cooper Howard says,
I certainly hope not. But us cowpokes, we take it as it comes, right?
And at the very end of episode 1, when we are just introduced to the ghoul, he says,
Us cowpokes. We take it as it comes.
Instantly showing us that this is the same guy. And this foreshadowing is something that the showrunners do time and time again in an elegant way. Another great example is with the ghoul character. The ghoul gets into a fight in the middle of Philly, and CX-404 has been following the Enclave guy this entire time. So when the ghoul attacks the Enclave guy, CX-404 attacks the ghoul. And in order to defend himself, the ghoul stabs the dog. But just a little bit later, after all of his enemies had left, he sees the wounded dog laying there. He brings him inside and revives him with a stim pack. Up until this point, the ghoul has been a very brutal character. Why would he even bother? Seems like a weird thing for the ghoul to do. But then we get a flashback to the ghoul in his previous life as Cooper Howard, and we learn that he had a dog named Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, I'm sorry you can't come, buddy. I'm heading into enemy territory.
He loves that dog. He talks to that dog like a person. The dog sort of acts as his conscience. When at one point he considers spying on his wife, It's by talking to his dog that he decides not to.
You're right, Roosevelt. What are you thinking?
He's making the dog a physical representation of his conscience. It's almost as if the dog represents the honest and good side of his nature, or at least the dog reminds him of it. He loves dogs so much that it causes friction in his marriage. He goes along with pretty much everything his wife wants, until he learns that Vault Tech won't allow dogs in vaults.
You know, no dogs in the vaults.
No dogs in the vault, says who? All I'm asking is, who decided that there were no dogs in the vault?
And that becomes a problem for him. It's the thing that ultimately causes him to decide to spy on his wife, to find out what Vault-Tec is really doing.
No dogs in the vault, huh?
He plays the role of a cowboy, and in one of the scenes at the end of the movie, he's supposed to shoot his enemy in the head. But he stops.
Do I really have to kill him?
Cuts?
He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't think it's very noble for a sheriff to shoot and kill an unarmed man. That's who he was before the war. We find out later when the ghoul finds a holotape of that very film that the director won. He didn't get his way. He was forced by someone else to murder that guy in the scene. It's almost like the show is telling us that as the ghoul, he's forced by someone else, by the wasteland, by survival, to become the violent ghoul that he is. But with this scene, saving the dog, not once, but twice, the show is telling us that the old Coop is still in there somewhere. He's not naive like a vault dweller, he's hardened by the wasteland, but there's a part of him that wants his conscience back, which is why he saves the dog. The ghoul character is a great example of how wonderful the writing in this show is, how complex these characters are, how interwoven the plot is with the past and the present and the lives of these people. I'm going to explore more of the excellent writing examples in other videos, but there are a few instances where the writing is a bit cringy. There's a scene where Maximus and Lucy stumble by chance into Vault 4, and everything at first seems fine. But then, all of a sudden, Lucy says,
You want to have sex?
You mean use my cock?
Yeah.
I don't know. That weird thing could happen.
What weird thing?
It gets all big and hard like a big pimple and then it pops.
What? Okay. Gross.
These are called oysters? You want one? They make you feel so good. You want to make my cock explode now? Sorry? Intercourse?
I remember watching this for the first time and going, oh, and cringing, and everyone watching with me kind of had a similar response. The camera pans out to a sign, giving us the impression that they were being experimented on, and at least when I was watching it, I thought maybe they were pumping weird chemicals or gases into the room that was causing them to say stupid things or, bring down their inhibitions. The problem is that we find out later that doesn't happen. Yes, they were in an experimental section of Vault 4, but the residents of Vault 4 weren't experimenting on them, and I'll cover this topic in greater detail when I do my video on Vault 4. So there really isn't anything that can explain why they spoke the way they did from the plot, which means it's kind of just weird. But I think the awkwardness of that exchange stood out to me so much because everything else in the show had been really good. The plot is pretty solid, but there were a few things that I worry might be plot holes. But I use the phrase plot hole loosely because it simply could be unexplained. Perhaps it looks like a plot hole now because we don't have the full story, which will be revealed in Season 2, and I'm perfectly happy to admit that. I have a pretty long list of these that I'll cover in a video later, but for now, here are a few plot holes that confuse me a little bit. For example, when we first meet Wilzig in the show, as an Enclave scientist, he injects something into his head. Then, afterward, he seems to know a lot of things he shouldn't know. He knows exactly how Vault 33 operates.
You come from Vault 33. You've been brought up in a meritocracy where people pride themselves on doing the right thing. You have a telesonic projector in your farm. It loops images of the Nebraskan countryside. Your primary crop is corn.
And he knows Lucy's last name.
Miss McLean.
How do you know my name?
I got the impression at the time that he knew these things because the chip he implanted into his head probably gave him that knowledge. It gave him that information. But without revealing end-of-story spoilers, we learned that the chip has nothing to do with memory. That is to say that he couldn't have known the things that he knew because of the chip he implanted in his brain, which makes me wonder how he knew all of that. It's possible he could have learned it from a terminal back at the Enclave, but the problem is that there's quite a lot that he could have learned from a terminal back at the Enclave that might have had access to pre-war Vault-Tec information, and he couldn't have memorized all of it, and he couldn't have known what information he was going to need when he left to go out into the wasteland. But it just so happened that he memorized the information that he was going to need, that he memorized the information about Vault 33 out of all of the hundreds of vaults, and he memorized information about a post-war vault dweller named Lucy McLean? That seems unlikely to me. I worry this might be a plot hole, but again, perhaps it's not. Another is that we learned that the ghoul served in the military before the bombs dropped. While he was in the military, he used T-45 power armor, and towards the end of the show, he wonders whether or not the T-60 has the same design flaw as the T-45. And we find out that it does. Someone can exploit this design flaw, if they know about it, to kill someone in power armor in one shot. The plot hole is that the ghoul fought Maximus in power armor towards the beginning of the series. It was a big firefight in Philly. There are great stretches of time where the ghoul is just repeatedly firing at Maximus in power armor, and Maximus is just sitting there taking it or walking through a barrage of bullets. If the ghoul knew about this weakness that power armor apparently had, why didn't he exploit it during that fight? Another is during the ghoul's fight with the Brotherhood, he gets the upper hand by removing a fusion core that turns off the lights. But everyone in that room had a flashlight on their power armor. All of the soldiers in T-60 had headlamps, and none of them thought to turn it on. Had they turned the headlamps on, they would have been able to see the ghoul, and their numerical superiority would have won them the day. That, I think, is a bit of a plot hole. We learned that the overseers for Vaults 32 and 33 are always chosen from Vault 31. And yet when the overseer of Vault 33 meets the overseer of Vault 32, he doesn't recognize her, but he should if they both came from the same vault. But even if he doesn't recognize her, that should raise warning flags to him, because he should know her. I suppose it's possible that he could not know every person who was in Vault 31, but we learn later that it's actually a pretty short list of people who were in 31. With that knowledge, I think it's more unlikely that he wouldn't know everyone in Vault 31, which means the fact that he wasn't alarmed that he didn't recognize her is a bit of a plot hole. But, as I said, this simply could be that it just hasn't been explained yet, and I'll explain it in Season 2. There were a few lore mistakes. At one point, Maximus and Lucy encounter fiends.
Fiends?
What's a fiend?
It's people who eat people.
He describes them as cannibals, but I don't believe they were. Fiends were introduced to us during Fallout New Vegas, and they're called fiends.
As in chem fiends. Biggest gang of raiders I've ever seen.
They were primarily known for abusing chems. Their leader operated out of Vault 3, and there were numerous raider members of the Fiends, most notably Cook. He was a very evil man who did some truly detestable things, but I don't recall cannibalism being among them. I could be wrong about that, but he was called Cook because he was a cook for the Fiends. He cooked Brahmin in particular. I think it's alluded to in the games at one point that he might have cooked children. But despite that, he's only one fiend. The fiends as a raider faction were more notable for abusing chems. The fiends were the primary customer of the great Khans, who were drug dealers. And if we defeat Motor Runner and explore Vault 3, we do find a bunch of people imprisoned, but they're not there to be served as food later. They're being held for ransom. If they were cannibals, you'd think they would have eaten them. Another explanation is that this may not be a mistake on the showrunner's part, but it may be a mistake on Maximus's part. At this point in the story, he's clearly trying to show off his wasteland knowledge in front of Lucy, and perhaps he's just repeating the name of a raider gang he heard one time while in the Brotherhood, and inventing a story about them. That said, this is many years after the events of Fallout New Vegas, and it's very possible that the fiends could have migrated west and resorted to cannibalism by this time. So it's not necessarily a mistake. But then we learned that the Brotherhood used to dominate the wasteland.
We once ruled the wasteland.
And I don't think that's true. On the West Coast, at least. On the East Coast, they did rule the wasteland after the fall of the Enclave during the events of Fallout 3. But on the West Coast, I can't think of a time where they ever did. Maybe during the events of Fallout 1, when they were operating out of Lost Hills. They were the only ones using power armor at that time. The Enclave wasn't in the picture. And we do see roaming Brotherhood patrols from time to time, but we see super mutant patrols more often than Brotherhood patrols. I think it would be more accurate to say that super mutants dominated the wasteland rather than the Brotherhood. In Fallout 2, their fortunes had worsened. They were in a weakened state. They had token presences at San Francisco and NCR, but no city of their own. They needed the Chosen One's help to get vertibird plans. But even assuming they got those vertibird plans during Fallout 2, in Fallout New Vegas, they are again in hiding. The Brotherhood had lost repeated battles to the NCR, at least in the Mojave Wasteland, but we have no indication that their fortunes had been better on the West Coast. But you know, now that I think about it, maybe he's referring to the Midwest. Perhaps the Brotherhood ruled the wasteland during the events of Fallout Tactics. Perhaps that's the canonical ending to Fallout Tactics. Maybe this Elder is a remnant of the Brotherhood that maybe defeated the Calculator during the events of Fallout Tactics. Or maybe he's just not very knowledgeable about Brotherhood history. He might genuinely think that the Brotherhood dominated the West Coast at some point. But they didn't, even though the NCR did. There comes a point when the leaders or representatives of some of the major corporations in the Fallout universe all convene in one big round table. And there we see RepCon alongside RobCon. The problem is that according to Fallout New Vegas, RepCon is owned by Robco.
The company really took off when Robco purchased RepCon in late 2076 to develop unmanned rockets to explore the solar system.
It's a minor subsidiary of Robco. It makes me wonder why RepCon would be represented at this big important meeting if Mr. House, the CEO of Robco, is already there. But these are pretty minor issues. They don't really have an effect on the overarching plot of the show, and they don't shake the fundamental foundations of the Fallout universe. The only other major mistake that I found, I talked about in a previous video, where we learned that Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277, a date that's impossible since the events of Fallout New Vegas happened in 2281. And that is a big deal. It undermines one of the major games that develops Fallout canon. And we know that this timeline on the chalkboard is a timeline rather than a flowchart, because it's pointing out moments in time on a line. Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277, as also evidenced by this scene in one of the closing segments of the show, where we see a library book in a locker in an elementary school. A library book that had been checked out of a library as early as 2189, but the last time it was checked out was November of 2276. And we find this book in the ruins of the Shady Sands Elementary School, just on the outskirts of the big crater that was once Shady Sands. if the quote-unquote fall of Shady Sands didn't really happen in 2277, and in fact it happened slowly over the span of 4 years so that the events of Fallout New Vegas in 2281 could happen, why then do we find this book that hasn't been checked out from a library in 5 years in a locker in a destroyed elementary school in a town that couldn't have been destroyed in the year 2277 for the events of Fallout New Vegas to happen? The only explanation is that it was destroyed in 2277. But check out my previous video on this topic for a deeper discussion of it. The show depicts the bombs dropping in the early afternoon or late morning during a child's birthday party in California. But the beginning sequence of Fallout 4 shows the bombs dropping in the morning. I've had some viewers sending me messages highlighting this as a lore discrepancy. And it might be, but it may also not be. 9:47 in the morning on the East Coast is 6:47 in the morning on the West Coast. So if we go by that time, then what we see in the show is wrong. This is not 6:47 in the morning. And this is a time that was established in Fallout 3. In Fallout 3, all of the clocks are stopped at the same time, 9:47 a.m. But then, when we go to Little Lamplight, we find an ancient holotape, and on it we learn that a teacher at the Early Dawn Elementary School was one of numerous chaperones who took the kids on a field trip to Lamplight Caverns.
Yesterday, October 23rd, 2077, half the school went on a field trip to Lamplight Caverns. We were packing up to leave when everything went crazy.
But October 23rd, 2077 was a Saturday. That's an odd day for an elementary school to go on a field trip. And if they were packing up to leave at nearly 7 a.m., exactly what time in the morning did they arrive at a cave system in Washington, D.C. for a field trip? Things change a little bit in Fallout 4 when we explore the switchboard entries. We learn that not every place in America was hit at the same time. New York and Pennsylvania, for example, were hit at 9:42 a.m., while Boston and Washington, D.C. were hit at 9:47. But during the events of Fallout New Vegas, the clocks on the wall all say 9:47 a.m., even though the game takes place in the ruins of Nevada. The reason for this, of course, is that they reused some assets from Fallout 3 when making Fallout New Vegas, and the clocks were one of them, and they just didn't change them. But even in Fallout 3, we do meet one ghoul who says that the bombs didn't drop at the same time everywhere. When we talk with Carol in the Underworld, a 200-year-old ghoul who lived through the nuclear apocalypse of 2077, she says that the West Coast was hit before the East Coast.
I was born in 2051, so yes, that makes me a pre-war ghoul. I was in a shelter with my father when the bombs hit. In DC, we had the luxury of getting a warning after the West Coast was gone.
To further complicate this, during the introductory slideshow of the Old World Blues DLC for Fallout New Vegas, the narrator says that the bombs dropped on the night of October 23rd, 2077.
On the night of October 23rd, 2077, the scientists received an answer that put all their questions to rest.
But when you talk to Mr. House, he tells us that by the afternoon in Nevada, on the day of October 23rd, 2077, the world had already ended.
That's where the chip was printed, on October 22nd, 2077. It was to have been hand-delivered to me here at the Lucky 38 the next day. But the bombs fell first.
So, it's a little complicated. We have some conflicting information in the source material, in the games. But if we go by the time that the bombs fell in Fallout 3 and in Fallout 4, then yes, this is a mistake. But again, it might not be. We learned from the show that non-feral ghouls can go feral, but that there's a drug out there that prevents them from going feral. The ghoul and Lucy stumble upon a ghoul who hasn't had this drug for a long time, and he's at the beginning stages of going feral. The ghoul character himself needs the drug, and if he doesn't have it, he gets sick and passes out. All of this is new. It's not found in any of the other games, which has led some viewers to suggest that this is a mistake. I don't see it as one. Time and time again, ghouls in the Fallout universe tell us that they don't know if or when they'll ever go feral. And in fact, during the Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4, we actually find an entire side story about a ghoul couple who went through this very problem. Rachel and her boyfriend Oswald worked at Nuka World in the Kitty Kingdom as entertainers, and they got stuck there when the bombs dropped on October 23, 2077. Due to the radiation, they were both turned into ghouls, as well as many of their other friends working there. And over the decades and centuries that passed since then, Rachel, with increasing distress, watched as her friends slowly went feral over time. Even though Rachel was a performer, she was also a trained scientist, and she spent a great deal of her time trying to find a way to cure a ghoul going feral.
I think this is it. I can't go any further. I can feel it taking me. Oswald, I'm sorry. I've looked everywhere I could think, but there's no cure.
She never found a cure, and ultimately, she began to feel herself going feral as well. She couldn't live with it, and so she committed suicide before it happened. So from this story, we clearly get the impression that there is no cure for turning feral. But we have to remind ourselves that just because a scientist stuck in an amusement park couldn't manufacture a cure over 200 years doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a cure or that there would never be a cure. My problem is that this cure appears to be well-known and widespread, or at least it was at one point. The ghoul character finds a huge stash of this wonder drug in a super-duper mart. He previously tried raiding pharmacies and doctors' offices and hospitals looking for this drug. A tactic used by many ghouls, the ghoul character finds one of his friends there. By the time of the show, the drug is in short supply. It's a pre-war drug that isn't being created any longer, and ghouls have been using it all over the place to not go feral. On one hand, I don't think that it's a mistake for there to be a drug out there that could cure being a ghoul. There were people in the universe who thought that it could be cured at one time, and people who tried to actively cure it. My problem is that why is it a pre-war drug? Ghouls didn't exist before the war, at least your average citizen in America didn't know that radiation could turn somebody into a ghoul, so it wasn't going to be stocked in local pharmacies, or stocked in supermarkets, or stocked in doctors' offices. If there was a pre-war drug that cured being a feral ghoul, it would be a huge secret, something uncovered in like a military bunker or a ruined scientific lab. One option is that maybe ghouls discovered a cure from something that wasn't intended to be a cure. Maybe by mixing a couple of under-sink detergents with a sprinkle of powdered Mentats and a sprig of whiskey, they created a cure. Somebody figured it out and spread the news. Maybe, but of course they don't explain that to us in the show. So it kind of is a problem, but it's one that could be explained. The show just hasn't explained it yet. Overall, the effects and CGI in the show are pretty doggone good. In particular, the Mr. Handy looks amazing, and I think the Mr. Handy was a practical effect. But the Gulper in the show looked pretty good too. I didn't see too much about this that screamed CGI, even though it clearly is, but there were a few moments of, well, just bad CGI. In particular, during the fight in Philly, when Maximus loses control of his power armor, he just sort of flies around in a very non-physics sort of way. It just didn't look right. I didn't really buy it. The Cyclops Overseer of Vault 4, I'm a little iffy about. I feel like sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. I don't know if it's just because I'm not used to seeing a Cyclops in real life and therefore it screamed CGI, or if it's genuinely bad CGI. But even when I saw the trailer for the first time, this scene stood out to me and it didn't really ring true. And then there's a scene where we see Hank as a much younger man, and they had to de-age Kyle MacLachlan for it. It doesn't really look good, especially since we know what Kyle MacLachlan looked like as a younger man. We know what he looked like in Twin Peaks, and he didn't look like this. I'm really satisfied with how they portrayed the Brotherhood. Before the show was released, I was afraid they were going to portray the Brotherhood as this, wasteland-dominating force that was setting up cities and patrolling the streets and delivering order and taking over the entire wasteland. And while they do claim to want to instill order, their primary goal throughout the series is the capture and preservation of technology.
You guys use pre-war technology to find and collect pre-war technology to make sure no one has pre-war technology?
I mean, yeah. Well, when you say it like that, yeah, it's weird.
For the most part, they stay at the ruins of their airport. But we learned that they got their orders from the East Coast.
Our mission comes from the highest clerics in the Commonwealth.
This is a bit of a reversal. It was always the West Coast elders who gave instructions to the East Coast. After all, they are the ones who dispatched Elder Lions to the East Coast. But it looks like, over time, the East Coast Brotherhood has become far more powerful than the West, and this actually makes a lot of lore sense. Lion's Brotherhood of Steel, with the Lone Wanderer's help, destroyed the Enclave during the events of Fallout 3 and had all of the technology at the mobile base crawler, at Adams Air Force Base, inside the Pentagon. Far more technology than the West Coast Elders ever had. Then they went to Boston, where they found lots of technology there. What's really interesting is that this show is set many years after the events of Fallout 4, and yet the Brotherhood is still in contact with the East Coast Elders. This tells us that 2 out of the 4 possible endings for Fallout 4 are now impossible. You can't end the game by siding with the Institute or the Railroad and leave the Brotherhood alive. Without the Pridwin, without Arthur Maxson, there is no Commonwealth Brotherhood. They didn't say Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, they said Commonwealth Brotherhood. If the Commonwealth Brotherhood exists all these years later, it means the Pridwin couldn't have been destroyed, which means that either the Brotherhood of Steel ending is canonical, or the Minuteman ending, where you leave the Brotherhood alive, is canonical, which means the Institute ending to Fallout 4 can't be canonical. We could try to argue around this by saying, well, maybe they got their orders from East Coast Brotherhood remnants, which leaves open the possibility that the Institute really won. I just don't see how it's possible for the East Coast to be giving orders to the West Coast if the East Coast wasn't more powerful than the West Coast. And if it is, they had to have survived the events of Fallout 4, which is impossible if the Institute won. I've seen some criticism with how the Brotherhood is depicted in the show concerning what appears to be specifically Christian Catholic traditions that have crept their way into the Brotherhood of Steel. In particular, we see scribes swinging a censer around, which in some Christian traditions burns incense and represents the prayers of the church rising towards heaven. And while that is true, it doesn't really bother me because we have to remember where these people came from. This is 200 years after the apocalypse, and these guys are trying to recreate a medieval order of knights. But Roger Maxson, who put the system together, didn't have a PhD in medieval history. He probably read Le Morte d'Arthur or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or something, and got inspired by Arthurian myth and medieval culture in general, and decided to adopt that for his order. So while we may see scribes swinging around specifically Catholic censers, they might not know what that means religiously. They might not be doing it with religious intent, and we don't have any other indication from the show that they are doing it with religious intent. It seems to be a tradition that this chapter of the Brotherhood has adopted because they saw it in a book or they saw it in a film, rather than because it has specific Christian religious meaning to them. So yes, it's new and it's unusual. That doesn't really bother me all that much. The destruction of the NCR is sad, but it's not a bad plot. After all, the destruction of the NCR is an optional storyline during the events of Fallout New Vegas. Democracies had fallen in the Fallout universe in the past. There's no reason why new democracies can't also fall. With the exception of the date that Shady Sands fell, 2277, I don't see anything lore-shattering about this. It's disappointing for me personally, as somebody who preferred the NCR to many of the other options during Fallout New Vegas, but its fall and its impact on the region is well told, and it's an interesting part of the overarching plot. I am a little sad that we weren't there for the destruction, that it sort of happened behind the scenes and we weren't a part of it, we didn't watch it, we show up and it's gone. I kind of feel like we've been robbed a little bit since we were there from the very beginning of Shady Sands. For it to be destroyed off camera while we're not there, that kind of doesn't sit well with me, and that is a bit disappointing. But as part of the architecture of this story, there's really no reason why they couldn't destroy the NCR. The series dives deep into Vault-Tec lore, particularly at the end of the series. And it's hard to talk about Vault-Tec lore without spoiling the ending of the series, which I don't want to do in this video. I will make a video talking all about it. But while all of the games mostly left Vault-Tec lore untouched, the show fleshes it out. It answers quite a few questions for us that fans have had for a very long time. It turns them into an active faction in the Wasteland. On one hand, I kind of wish that they had left Vault-Tec as this sort of dark and shadowy boogeyman, off in the distance somewhere or buried deep in the past. By being able to put faces to Vault-Tec as an organization, it makes it feel a little less scary, a little less insidious. But in reality, we learn exactly how awful they were. If we thought they were an evil, soulless organization for the experiments they did to people in their vaults, we walk away from the show realizing that they were truly monsters. And yet, even Vault-Tec thought that they were doing good. They thought that they were saving the world. All in all, I give the Fallout show 8 out of 10. There were a few things about the plot that either I'm just confused about or are genuinely mistakes and plot holes, but they're mostly minor, and for the majority of the 8-hour runtime for this series, I was enthralled in the Fallout universe, and I was absolutely thrilled to see the best things in a game franchise that I've loved for many years come to life on the screen. I'll be covering absolutely everything in this series in deeper detail and with even more spoilers in the coming days and weeks. We're talking characters, complete faction overviews, vault deep dives, and more. So if you don't want to miss my next episode, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification button. If you like what I do and you want to support me in another way, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I update Twitter manually with every new piece of content that I publish. I've got a plush for sale. My one-of-a-kind plush is ready to ship, but I've got limited stock, and I've already sold most of my inventory. So if you want to make sure that you get one before I run out, snag one now. I've also got a shirt shop with completely unique designs that you can't find anywhere else. My designs come on shirts in a variety of men's, women's, and children's sizes, and in a wide array of colors. You can find them on other stuff as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in another way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. YouTube members get little badges that appear next to their names in the comment sections of my videos, and they gain access to ox emojis that they can use in my video comments and in the live chats of my live streams. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new videos.